From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. Without further ado, this is the story of a little something called Project Azorian. Here are the facts. Let's go back to the 60s, 1960s.
Cool, Daddy-O.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how they talked in the 60s, or is that more the 50s?
You know what? I feel like there were probably people saying "cool, Daddy-O" in the 60s. There were probably still.
That was a holdover. It's kind of like 1979 versus 1980. It didn't immediately become the 80s. There was some holdover, 70s lingo that stuck around. But yeah, we're in the 60s, swinging. Things are happening. Submarines. Kind of a big deal. The height of military tech would allow you to evade tons of what are called countermeasures in terms of being detected, in terms of being, eliminated by the enemy, and like sneaking, into enemy lines to do surveillance, all kinds of things. Submarines were your best bet. You could observe things without the usual intervention of pesky land or air forces, just little crabs and sea creatures, playing in a jazz band. Right?
Under the sea. Calypso, right? Darling, it's better. Yeah. Now, that's a very good point, but this is not to say that submarines were by any means perfect. Any number of things could result in their detection or their destruction, and as of now, it is impossible to know just how many people have met their deaths entombed in the watery graves of sunken submarines, which is a terrible way to go, especially if you have claustrophobia and a fear of drowning. This is the world into which the K-129 emerges. It's a submarine. The K-129 is part of what NATO calls the Gulf II class. It's a ballistic missile sub with a diesel-electric power system. There's an important distinction here because if you hear about this story, you'll often hear K-129 described as a nuclear sub, but it is not nuclear powered. It is a diesel-electric vehicle, or it was, capable of carrying nuclear weapons. Not the same thing, but still very, very dangerous. Completed in 1959, and it was patrolling the seas successfully on a routine basis until March of 1968. And that's when Soviet naval officials concluded something had gone sideways.
Mm-hmm. Sideways, like that wine movie.
I still don't like that one.
You don't like it?
I really like it.
They're very unpleasant characters. There's no questioning that. None of them have particularly redeeming qualities, but I always did. I enjoyed that filmmaker, Alexander Payne, either way. But yeah, you're right. They're all a bunch of movie about a bunch of wine jerks is what Sideways is. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about a real debacle at sea. Like any other deployed vessel, the K-129 had a regular schedule of check-ins. So it was about mid-March of 1968 when K-129 missed not one, but two of these scheduled radio check-ins, with commanding officers or, HQ or whatever you want to call it. Time went on. The urgency of the communications to K-119 increased significantly, including like straight up orders, commands to break radio silence that went unacknowledged. After nearly 2 months of silence, so by the third week of March, the Soviet government considered K-129 to be missing, maybe not fully lost yet, because they first have to launch a large-scale search and rescue mission in the North Pacific from Kamchatka and Vladivostok, the kind of thing that you really can't cover up for too long.
Right, not the search effort, because the streets, or in this case, the seas, are watching. Streets are watching. So Uncle Sam has eyes on this and instantly knows something is up. Because both sides of the Cold War are like exes who have recently split. They're obsessively tracking each other. And it didn't take long for U.S. intelligence to say, hey, wait, these ships and these subs are deviating from their normal patterns of patrol. Why? What gives? What are they doing? And eventually they concluded, hey, this is exactly what we would do if we lost a submarine somewhere. So let's get the boffins and the eggheads on it. And they were
the boffins?
Yeah, the
What's
boffins.
A boffin? Is that
I'm
like
watching
a
a lot of British stuff. Yeah.
I love it, dude.
Boffins are the nerds. It's the British.
Perhaps wonk adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
You got your
Yes.
wonks and your boffins and your eggheads.
Just so, yeah.
Poindexters,
so,
got it.
Yes, yeah. And so they said, okay, let's go back to our scientists, our researchers, and let's see what SIGINT they have, or signals intelligence. At the time, and even now, the U.S. had what's called a hydrophone network, underwater surveillance that is meant to detect noises and irregularities across the globe, whether those are whale songs, whether they're sonar, whether they're underwater explosions. And they said, okay, boffins, go back through your records around this time and see if there's anything out of the ordinary that kind of correlates with the deviation in Soviet patrol patterns. And they found it. They said, they reviewed the recordings, and they based on the guesswork of those intelligence experts watching the change in naval patterns, and they found a record of a mysterious underwater implosion on March 8th, 1968, and they were even able to isolate it to an area of just like about 5 nautical miles.
I think every time we talk about underwater naval implosions or explosions, I always recommend the Ridiculous History episode that we did about the Hunley with Rachel Lance, who is like not only an expert in underwater implosions and explosions, she is like the world's most specific nerd in that department.
Yes.
I love it. She's incredible. She wrote a book about it and actually made it really exciting. The Hunley was like, what was it, a Civil War submarine where I had like Flintstones pedals kind of. It was definitely not the level of tech that we're talking about today, but she goes into some great detail about what an underwater implosion does to like viscera, and like the body.
It's hellish. It's hellish. Also, shout out to Rachel for busting one of the biggest myths in action movies. If you are in an explosion that is powerful enough to knock you in the air and back, you don't get up and say, "I'm getting too old for this." No. You are FUBAR. So the U.S. discovers this, and if we go with the earlier thesis, Noel, that governments are always on the up and up, they would have told the Soviets, hey, we think we found your sub. Of course, they didn't do that. They quietly waited for the Soviet Navy to give up searching. The Soviets were also, by the way, searching in the wrong spot, as we'll come to find. So the Soviet forces, instead, after a long, harrowing search, instead of finding anything, they quietly said the K-129 is lost, along with all 98 souls aboard. And this was delightful to the U.S. They were already, just as quietly, working on something else, a grand conspiracy at sea, unlike anything that had ever happened before. They wanted to steal an entire submarine from the depths of the ocean without letting anyone, including the American public, know a thing about it.
You sly bastards. You sly American dogs, you. Wait, that's us.
Right.
I mean, it's an opportunity, that's for sure.
Yeah, and it's also not just sly, but it's ambitious. So this is where the conspiracy begins. Here's where it gets crazy. Because the CIA was acutely aware of the treasure trove under those frigid waters in the middle of the Pacific. And as far as they were concerned, at first, price was no object. But there were problems. Like, according to their calculations, the sub sank at a 40.1 degrees north latitude, 179.9 degrees east longitude. If you pull that up on like Google Earth or Google Maps or whatever, you're going to see that is in the middle of nowhere in the North Pacific. It's like Cthulhu country. It's the closest, like for reference, if you look at Hawaii, it's about 1,500 nautical miles northwest of Hawaii. And nautical miles are not quite the same as a mile for landlubbers.
As the crow flies?
Let's say as the crow swims, and I'm sure a crow would be pissed if they had to swim, but
I'm
it's
sure they'd make a good go of it, them being so smart and all.
Yeah, they try. They're smart enough, maybe, that they would eventually build a boat. Who knows? They would, if you were a crow in a boat and you were looking at a nautical mile, it's a little more than a regular mile because it's based on the longitude and latitude coordinates. So it's a slightly different calculation. It's 1.15 land miles. Anyway, point is, in the middle of nowhere. This sub sinks in the middle of nowhere, and they know that it sinks deep. When we say deep, we mean very deep, 4,880 meters or 16,000 feet into the depths. This thing is lost.
Cthulhu depths.
Right? Cthulhu depths, yeah. So they decide that they, being the U.S., decide that since it's obvious the Russians don't know where this sub is, they can be first to the gate. They can try to find it. So they send out another submarine, right? One of their own.
Yep, just for the halibut. They sent out the USS Halibut. I'm sorry. I every time I see that word, I have to say that joke.
I did. I think so too. I did a back in Boy Scouts. We used to do a night of plays, which just descended into pun-based sketch comedy. Yes. And we got in trouble one time because we wrote a sketch about a serial killer who kept calling over people from like a fish delivery service and murdering them. And the punchline is, the last guy at the fish place is like, "Wait, you killed everyone who worked? Why?" And the guy shrugs and says, "For the halibut." Our adults were not amused.
Yeah, it's just classic. Never get old. I do have to say, though, it seems like a really wimpy name for a submarine. I find the halibut to be like one of the more bland and innocuous fishes of the sea. Why not like the USS Tiger Shark or something? The USS Halibut I don't really fear the USS Halibut. But it was deployed from Pearl Harbor, yes, that Pearl Harbor, in Hawaii, to where they believed the sub wreckage would be found. And this operation was dubbed Sand Dollar. And after 3 weeks of searching, the halibut did, in fact, find that wreckage and took a lot of photographs of the K-129, which is what convinced Nixon and his staff to take to the high seas, pirate style, rattling their sabers, and they all donned eye patches and striped shirts.
Yes, yo ho ho, indeed. So this is, I love that we're pointing this out. Halibut does seem to be an innocuous name, and there are a couple of reasons. Maybe the person who got to name this sub was like, the halibut is a proud, noble fish. But there's also a compelling argument that this submarine was partially chosen because it did sound like an ordinary run-of-the-mill thing. We'll see why that's important later, but yes, piracy on the high seas. The president of the country turns into a pirate at the behest and the urging of two guys who work closely with him, Melvin Laird and Henry Kissinger. You know them? You know them. They were the two big champions of this idea, and I just picture them pitching a sub-heist to President Nixon. Somehow it worked. The U.S. starts brainstorming, and they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to recover all the wreckage from the sub, and we're going to learn more about Soviet nuclear missile technology, but just as importantly, we're going to learn about how they get away with all their sneaky codes. They wanted the cryptography. They wanted the code books that Soviet officials in the HQ you mentioned used to communicate with Soviet submarines. And for waxing poetic, Uncle Sam said, this is an opportunity to steal the arms, the ears, and the tongue of our adversary.
Gross.
Yeah, gross, but that's war.